Is it just like natural silence? That was amazing. I think that means it's ready to begin this great program. Hello, my name is Stephen Tepper, and I am the brand new president here at Hamilton College. And I'm so excited to see everybody here in person. It's a great turnout, and I know we also have people who are watching from afar on our stream. I want to thank you for coming to our very first Common Ground this semester, Competing Interests, a conversation on the future of college sports. And a very special welcome to our panelists, Amy Privett-Perko, Jim Cavale, and our moderator, Jeremy Foley, and there'll be longer introductions in just a bit. And one other shout out to Kit Morris, former Senior Director of College Sports and Marketing at Nike, a great career there, and a former CEO of the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics. And he really helped us to set up the panel for tonight, so thank you, Kit. A little short intro to Common Ground. So Common Ground brings respected thought leaders to the Hamilton campus to participate both in small class conversations and these larger event forums. And the topics are intertwined with the college's curriculum, and they're chosen to foster critical thinking and around difficult and often contentious national and global policy issues. And so here's the thing, that we pick topics that are complex in every way, in their social dynamics, their economics, their philosophical, ethical issues. And so anybody who shows up today thinking they are 100% sure they know the answer to the questions tonight, I am 100% sure that you do not. And that's by design. That's what Common Ground is about. It's a little bit of intellectual humility. It doesn't mean we have strong positions, strong ideas. We will audition those. You will hear those. But it does mean that you're here to try to learn something and maybe think a little differently than when you came in. Common Ground is thankful for the indispensable support from Hamilton alumni, especially Mary Helen and Robert Morris and Lori and David Hess. And a plug for Common Ground's next event, which is tomorrow night, September 10th, the Common Ground Ambassadors. If you're in the room, could you identify yourselves? Anybody? Yes? Hands up. Thank you, Common Ground Ambassadors. We'll give you a little applause for all that you do. So they are hosting Politics and PJs, the Presidential Debate Watch Party, at 9 p.m. at KJ in the Red Pit, and pajamas are welcome. Snacks will be provided. My pajamas are still in the moving truck coming from Phoenix, so if you see me tomorrow night, it will not be in pajamas. Now it's my honor to introduce our moderator, and then he will introduce our panelists. Jeremy Foley is the athletic director emeritus at the University of Florida. He began his career at Florida as an intern at the Gator Ticket Office. In 1979, he became athletic director in 1992, a position he held for 25 years. And during his tenure, Florida won 3 football national championships. He's the only AD to have achieved that feat, and Florida is the only school to win championships in its football and men's basketball in the same year. And during his time as AD, he won 27 national championships. And earlier tonight I said, why couldn't you have won 28? Like, weren't you more ambitious? And he said there were another 2 the year after he left. If he had stayed one more year, it would have been 29. He did an incredible job there, 130 SEC championships, and Florida was rated as one of the top 10 athletic programs for 33 straight years. Jeremy also added 3 women's sports during his tenure, and in 2006, he was named National Athletic Director of the Year. He oversaw a program that gave $76 million to University of Florida academic endeavors. And in retirement, he serves on many boards, continues to mentor students and young professionals in the sports world. And one other thing, Jeremy played Division III football and lacrosse just down the road at Hobart. So welcome back to New York, Jeremy. So please join me in welcoming Jeremy Foley, Amy Privett-Perko, and Jim Cavale.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be with you all tonight. As Mr. President just said, I did go to Hobart, and I'm a D3 athlete, but being back on this campus, great memories, being around the students today. It's a great honor, and I know I speak for both Jim and Amy. We appreciate you inviting us. We appreciate being here tonight. So we are going to talk a little bit about the future of college athletics. I'm going to briefly introduce these two. I'm then going to set the table a little bit about some things going on in college athletics I think will give you a better idea why we're talking about the future. And then we're going to get after it with Jim and Amy. But again, thank you for being here tonight. I'd like to first introduce Amy Perko. She's the CEO of the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics. She is a recognized leader in college sports. I've known Amy ever since I was AD there at Florida. She's always been a voice of reason in the business, and obviously an advocate for every student athlete in the profession. She is a college basketball player at Wake Forest. She's in Wake Forest's Hall of Fame. She was recognized by the NCAA with a silver anniversary award. That's 25 years after she graduated. They only give out 6 a year. Incredible honor. Amy was a recipient of that. And in 2015, she was a Sports Business Journal game changer. And certainly she's worked her whole life to effect change in this profession. Before I do, Jim, Amy, quickly tell these folks what the Knight Commission does.
Yeah, the Knight Commission, we're funded by the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. We're an independent think tank whose purpose really is to lead transformational change that prioritizes education, health, safety, and success of college athletes. And I look forward to sharing more about our views on the issues at hand.
Thank you, Amy. I'd like to introduce now Jim Cavallo. He's the CEO of athletes.org. Highly successful entrepreneur. He's a former college baseball player, D2 and D3 player. He's built and sold multiple companies in the sports and fitness industry. He founded a sports tech app called Influencer that 220 Division I schools subscribe to, and supporting student athletes and building their social media brands. He sold it in 2023. And he started athletes.org, which is a players association. I'm going to talk more about that in just a minute. He has been named by ESPN one of the top 11 power brokers in college sports, and he was named by Sports Business Journal as top 40 under 40. So Jim, why don't you briefly tell them what athletes.org does, please?
Yeah, just like in pro sports, you have players union that represents the interests of the players with the league. College sports is desperately missing that, and desperately missing a partnership between the league and its athletes. And so athletes.org is built to organize athletes, give them the support they need to make key decisions, but also give them a voice and a seat at the table with their schools as all these new decisions about the new frontier of college athletics are being made.
Thank you, Jim. All right, just briefly, why are we talking about the future of college athletics, intercollegiate athletics? Why do we have competing interest here? Let me just give you just a quick synopsis of things that are going on in D1. Maybe repetitive for some of you, but if you don't understand what the issues are, then I'm not sure our conversation will be quite as meaningful. I started at the University of Florida in 1976. Our athletic budget there was $7 million. When I retired in 2016, it was $120 million, and I've been retired for 8 years now, and it's $181 million. There are 2 athletic programs in America. Their athletic budget exceeds $220 million. Division I sports generated and spent in 2022 $95 billion. I paid Steve Spurrier in 1996 $2 million. It was the first $2 million salary in all of college sports. Made huge news. Right now we have football coaches making $13 million, $11 million. We have 6 making $10 million. NCAA basketball tourney, TV money. You all watch March Madness. That generates $1.1 billion a year. The Big Ten new television contract, $1 billion. The SEC just handed out to its membership $750 million. And athletes can transfer at will. It's called a transfer portal. You used to have to sit out a year. There's no more of that. There's a new, and we had some conversation today with some of the student athletes, so obviously this part is not unfamiliar in this room. It's called name, image, and likeness, which allows athletes to benefit from their name, image, and likeness. which I'm 100% for, but what it's turned into is a pay-for-play, a recruiting inducements. There's a football team in this country whose football team has been built this year with $20 million of name, image, and likeness, okay, money, all right? Quarterbacks making $600,000 or $700,000. There are athletes making 7 figures right now. That's the current environment in college athletics. There are lawsuits galore because athletes want their piece of the pie. Coaches making $13 million, $1 billion television contracts. Obviously, that's being generated by the athletes. So obviously, that makes sense. However, it has totally changed the landscape of what I did for 40 years, AD for 25 years. And I'm not here to rail about change. I'm not the old guy in the room who's not willing to change, but is therefore why we're sitting here today talking about a future that is difficult at best. So they describe college athletics right now, a lot of people, as the wild, wild west. It is a wild, wild west. Whether it's good or bad, we'll discuss that in a minute. So the first question I have for Jim and Amy, and we'll let Amy start on this, is how did we get here? Is it only because of the money? Is it because of lack of leadership? Because some of these things have been anticipated earlier, and I'm Monday morning quarterbacking here, but there's a reason we're here today. And first of all, I was part of the system. I paid a coach $2 million, which back then might be worth $10 million. But I'm saying we are in a system that's incredibly difficult now. So, Amy, how did we get here?
Yeah, great question, and thanks for giving that background. As you've said, there's so much change going on right now, but how do we get here? A couple things I would say. Our organization has worked to push policy changes and changes that we think are good for the collective and for the good of the future of college sports and that will enhance college athletes' experiences. Just a quick example, when I started with the Knight Commission, I thought it was going to be a 2-year consulting job because we were pushing for an academic threshold for postseason eligibility. And our goal was to help improve graduation rates in Division I. Graduation rates for football and men's basketball players were very low. University presidents were embarrassed about it, and they said, we've got to change something here to improve graduation rates, create more accountability. So we pushed a solution that teams should have to be on track to graduate at least half their players to be eligible for March Madness and championships. What some now say, that's a pretty low bar. Again, we thought this is going to happen. We can get this done in 2 years. Jeremy, it took 10 years, right? So policy change happened a lot slower than what we felt it should happen. Now, since then, graduation rates for Division I have reached an all-time high. And people now say, yeah, that seems like that policy should have always been in place. So the lesson there is sometimes change happens slowly. And why we are here today, you mentioned name, image, likeness, and that's been one of the most, dynamic changes that has been created in terms of allowing athletes to have the compensation for their NIL. The Knight Commission, we held the first national public meeting about name, image, likeness in 2008. I think a lot of you were maybe in first grade, so it wasn't even called NIL then, but it was about these video games, and the avatars in these video games were starting to look an awful lot like the actual players. The players were not getting royalties like pro players did in Madden, as an example. And we said, from a policy standpoint, that's really not fair. So either don't have the video games, or you got to change the rules to give the athletes their fair share for the use of their name, image, likeness. Fast forward several months, Ed O'Bannon files a lawsuit, and the NCAA at that time chose we're just going to litigate this because we don't want to change our policy. Fast forward it, to Ed O'Bannon wins the lawsuit, and it still was an opportunity for the NCAA to change. But again, the NCAA did not want to change its policy, and then it was forced to change. And so now we're in a chaotic environment because, and what we've said all along is it's time for the university presidents and the leaders, the athletic directors, commissioners to decide the future that's best for college athletes and best for the future of college sports, but because of a lack of action and not wanting to disrupt the status quo, now what's happening is the courts are deciding the future of college sports.
Why are we here, Jim?
Well, I think going along with the timeline that Amy just provided, there's been a lot of clues that leaders in the industry could have been proactive in getting in front of, but the time it took, for instance, with the Ed O'Bannon case, which to me was writing on the wall that name, image, and likeness was inevitable. It wasn't a matter of if but when, once Ed O'Bannon beat the NCAA, because his likeness was used in a basketball video game that he and the other athletes weren't paid for. The second he won that case, that's when you got to get on offense. You got to say, okay, how do we do this in a way that's going to work with our model, right? And when you try to do that in college athletics, and these folks know more than anyone, it's hard because there's so many competing interests. There's only a certain amount of schools that play big-time college football, big-time college basketball, and they're supporting a lot of other sports at their school, let alone the fact that there's other schools outside of that that have their interests. So getting everyone to agree has been very difficult. But one thing that happened from 2008, when she told that story, to the present, is revenues exploded. And the commercialization of media deals going into a multi-billion-dollar a year revenue stream for the schools dramatically and exponentially grew. And so it just really was a perfect storm of, okay, we already have this court case we've lost. Name, image, and likeness and compensating athletes through name, image, and likeness is inevitable. How do we structure it? And then we've got these revenues exploding. The pie is getting bigger. For some athletes, a scholarship might not still be enough. We might have to do more than that. And figuring those two things out could have stopped a lot of where we are today, where it's been forced upon college athletics.
Yeah, like Amy said, the courts are dictating how we're running our profession. You know, when I was setting the table there and I talked about lawsuits galore, there's a lawsuit, it's called the House. It's a plaintiff's lawsuit, the House settlement. They're trying to settle the case. It was supposed to get settled last Friday, and there was some snafus, but it's the most significant court case out there, and if it gets settled, because the NCAA does not want to go to court on that, you know, the NCAA owes to athletes in the past something like $2.1 billion that we're going to have to be paid. Everybody, NCAA schools are going to have to collectively pay. But the most significant part of that lawsuit, in my opinion, is that schools are going to have to start sharing their revenue with the student athletes. All right? The court's not going to tell you how to do that, but the formula that's part of the settlement is $20 to $22 million is going to come out of the existing revenue pool that the University of Florida had and other schools have, and now has to pay that to the athletes, okay? So with that background, and I can tell you right now, I haven't done it for a long, long time, balancing budgets, I don't care what school you're at, it's very, very difficult. And you've got to take $20 million out of your revenue stream and now give them to athletes, and they may be deserving of that. That's not my point here, all right? But I want to read something from the Knight Commission that I found, because it's kind of how I ran the shop at Florida for 25 years. I'm quoting now. It's time to get back to first principles. Intercollegiate athletics exists first and foremost for the student athletes, whether male or female, majority or minority, whether they play football in front of $50,000 or field hockey in front of their friends. And that's what I always believed in. A lot of people in this country believe in. You know, the total sports program is incredibly important. All 21 sports at Florida. Added 3 women's sports, okay? So knowing now that the revenue that we're dealing with, just talking about, the thing that frustrates me, and I'm in a retired chair, is who's been looking out for the interest of the total program, what I would call the enterprise? Who's been looking out for it? We're trying to settle lawsuits. We owe people money. We're going to pay athletes money. That's going to have an effect on these other sports. So, you know, Jim, I'll start with you. Maybe that's Pollyannish on my part to say that, but who's supposed to be looking out for the total enterprise?
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with the enterprise thinking about it for itself and thinking about it based on the future and not what they're used to doing. And so the reality is college athletics programs are a part of higher education institutions that have, no matter how much money they've made, spent just about as much as they've made every year. They found a lot of places to spend it. You just talked about going from $7 million to $180 million at Florida from the time you were starting to where we are today. They found a lot of other places to spend money. Guess where they spent it? On attracting talent, because you can't win without talent, and you can't keep making money without talent. So they spend it on facilities. They spend it on all kinds of barber chairs in the locker room, and all the things you've read about is where they spend it. Well, now they're used to spending on all these things. They've also had to fund new sports, and now they have to find $20 million. And that is going to be hard, especially when another place they spend it is coach salaries. Not just coach salaries, but coach buyouts. Jimbo Fisher just got fired last year, and he's getting paid $75 million to sit on the couch and watch the games. And that's happening a lot in college football, where there's big contracts, where they're making 8 figures a year, and if they don't do well, they fire them. Auburn has 3 coaches right now in the last 5 years. And the current one's struggling right now, too. So it's like, are they going to put him on the hot seat? It's a really interesting situation, because it's really all about the enterprise looking out for itself and looking at the pie every year and looking at the slices of allocation to coaches, to staff, to facilities, and looking at that slice that's been going to the student athlete, which is scholarships and benefits. And it went from 20% of gross revenue. Then it gets down to 15% of gross revenue. Then it gets down to 11% of gross revenue. And at some point, you got to say, we need to make sure we invest more in that slice of the pie, or else. And so last thing I'll say is, athletes while they're in college, first of all, they're doing whatever they're told to do, and they don't want to rock the boat. And most athletes are busy and have a little amount of time to learn about all this. As you know, athletes here, it's a full-time job, really, along with school. But when they get out, they become Ed O'Bannon. They become Alston. They become Hubbard. They become Carter. They become Johnson, House. And that's where, if we educate the athletes while they're in school on how the business works at the school and let them have a say in what's decided, there's a lot more chance that you can have a partnership that can protect yourself from these lawsuits.
And that's your organization's goal?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's the only sustainable path for college athletics, because without a partnership, there'll continue to be lawsuits, and there'll be nothing to protect the schools in those lawsuits because they don't have a deal with their athletes. And we've seen it work in pro sports, but it doesn't exist in college.
And would you say your organization's focus is on just the football and basketball piece of this?
Absolutely not. That's why when we launched with a brand name like athletes.org. We said it's for all athletes, all divisions, all sports. But when it comes to starting from scratch, there's 500,000 student athletes in this NCAA realm, and our focus is the 10,000 athletes that play Power Conference football, men's and women's basketball, because those athletes make up more than 90% of the revenue produced in all of college sports. And so organizing those athletes first is a focus, but we're for all athletes. And what I've noticed when I've sat down at universities and talked to athletes who represent each sport in one room, which we've done many times, I've learned that athletes who don't play football understand that football produces a great deal of their revenue and is the reason they have scholarships and they have facilities. And if they don't know that, they're willing to learn it. And once they learn it, there's a way for all athletes to be able to find something that they feel is the best benefits package for them. But the only way they can do that is they need the types of facts that you guys do such a great job of putting out for leaders in college sports. Athletes need to understand that stuff, and that's why we started this.
So, Amy, who looks out for the whole enterprise?
Well, in terms of who looks out, it should be, the university presidents set the tone, set the philosophy for college sports that exist at our universities. And in terms of, what the Knight Commission has tried to do, and with our purpose, is putting the athletes at the center. And in terms of, we've advocated for a long time that college athletes should have a greater voice at the policy table. There is a National Student Athlete Advisory Committee, but it's advisory, and there should have been more athlete votes and in actual policy. And so that's something that still should change. And actually, college football is probably the most underrepresented in terms of athletes' voice at the policy table. Another, change that we've really pushed, and something that, I want to go back to a little bit of how we got here and talk about one of our solutions for where we think it should go. But I want to set the stage as well. Obviously, a lot of the things we're talking about with the revenue really only applies to 60 to 70 schools. Those 60 to 70 power schools, and what's happening with the courts and some of the state legislatures, and even the public perception is all really guided by what they see with those 60 to 70 schools. And so we want to make sure that there may be something very different structure that needs to happen for football, and we've actually proposed that. But we want to make sure that the solution that works for big-time college football is not the same solution that works for Division III. And our fear is that what is happening, that those problems are overwhelming the entire ecosystem, and that what could happen as an outcome could harm Division III, Division II, and some of the athletic programs at Division I schools that, have a very different budget. But for those 60 to 70 schools, every other college sports program really relies on the institution to fund and support those opportunities, and student fees to fund and support those opportunities. And we, the Knight Commission, we see these 4 years you have as a college athlete, we want this to be a transformational experience for college athletes. That's what it was for me as an athlete, and not just a transactional experience in terms of how much money am I going to make from NIL this year or that year. Again, we support NIL, but again, college sports needs to be a transformational experience for young people, not just a transactional one. But our solution in terms of college football was there should be a separate entity to govern big revenue football, and it needs to be funded by the College Football Playoff, which is separate from the NCAA. And then the NCAA can better govern all the other sports. One of the most misunderstood facts is that the NCAA really receives zero in revenue from the College Football Playoff. It receives zero in revenue from big revenue football, but yet it is absorbing the legal liabilities, the House case, that's going down the line. And that's just an alignment. It's a misalignment, but it's only that way because we haven't changed it. It's just built up through the system. The College Football Playoff started in 2015. And you look at, we've got all the data on severance pay, coaches' salaries, and that's when it really exploded, when the College Football Playoff began, and the money has flowed disproportionately, as Jim said, to the coaches, and so that's led to, a lot of where we are now. I do believe that in 2030 there will be a College Football Super League. If we continue down the path we're on now, there still will be a Super League in 2030, but it will be because that's what the networks want, and not because that's the decisions that college leaders made. Jeremy, in 2011, we hosted a public meeting, and at that time, it was around the time of the first kind of big realignment when Texas A&M went to the SEC, and the then chancellor at LSU said, I believe we're going to end up with two conferences, one named Fox and one named ESPN. And just so you know, Fox is invested with the Big Ten, Fox is the Big Ten partnership, SEC is the ESPN partnership. And if you look at what's happened since then, both those conferences have grown, that's where the money is, and that's what TV wants, consolidation. And our point is, if you're going to let the networks run college sports, then, that's a different business. And that's where college football is right now. That's who runs college football. But let's return and put the athletes first and have a better policy for all these other sports that are frankly going to, there's going to be a lot of lost opportunities with some of those other sports if we move forward with the path that's been drawn out.
I've heard some people say that, in fact, there's a former colleague of mine who was testifying in front of Congress and talking about the system we're in. If we don't change it, it's going to cause us to drop sports, and that's another conversation here in a minute. But then one of the national sports writers made the comment, it's not football's job to support all the other sports. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I don't think that it's football players' job to support all the other sports. And I think that the amount of revenue that football produces at those 60 to 70 schools should be shared proportionately with those players. I think that it would be very fair and equitable to do that. And instead, we want football to not do that so that we can pay for all the other sports when nobody else is making sacrifices. There can be sacrifices made in a lot of places. That's why you have a negotiation. That's why you put together a plan that all sides can speak into. But yeah, I don't think it's fair that football has to pay for everything in the sense of football players not getting paid so that other sports can be supported. But I do think that there's a beautiful way where football can continue to fund those athletic programs outside of football at those schools. And it's through one league. If there's anywhere where we have common ground, Amy and I, it's on that. Like, college football is the second most popular sport in this country, behind the NFL. And it gets outperformed by the other pro sports leagues. The NBA, MLB, $3 to 1 per consumer, $6 to 1 per consumer. And it's because it's not ran like a real business. It's starting to be ran like a business, which is why revenues have exploded. But if you get the top schools, you put them in one league with one media deal that they all share in, you give the best teams upside, and you really create a system where there's central scheduling, you have the best matchups every weekend, there's billions more dollars per year available over time for the schools that play in that league. And they're going to be sharing that money back with their school and their athletic department to pay for the sports at those schools, which those schools are the training grounds for our Olympic teams that just won all the gold medals they just won. So there's a way this works, but you have to have a line item on that budget that compensates the athletes for those football teams that are helping produce that billions of dollars per year of revenue.
And is that how you and the Knight Commission envisioned a separate football model?
Well, we didn't map out all of what needs to happen in detail after you create that model, because from our standpoint, to begin addressing the problems that are there, you have to start with the structure. And so our call was for, there has to be a different structure. This is misaligned right now, and until we get the structure right, the solutions that are going to come out of this misaligned structure really aren't going to work in the long run for all in the best way that they can. We think our proposal to have a separate entity for football will better enable leaders to tailor solutions for that sport. It's a unique sport. It's a high injury sport. Players need to have protection. Players need to have long-term medical care protection. There are unique issues with that sport. And then from a structural standpoint, then the NCAA can focus on reorganizing around its unifying sport of basketball and really addressing all of the other sports in a much better way than they have in the past. I mean, it's, as Jim said, all the other sports, we have obviously a unique system in the world, and our system is the reason America, won the gold medals, the count at the Olympics. 76% of the medalists participated in college sports. So again, not saying it solely for that, but just all of the incredible experiences over 500,000 athletes receive every year. We want to make sure that athletes have those experiences and opportunities moving forward, and we don't want to see the opportunities being lost because we're not ready to call a duck a duck. Big revenue football is highly commercial, and it needs a different structure and a different setup. And you got to start there before you can create the solutions. And again, the college football playoff just expanded, $1.4 billion a year, doubles what the college football playoff did bring in. So that's 600, 700 million new money flowing into the system, and that's been a major part of the problem as well.
By adding 3 games to the season, right, and more teams to the playoff, and the players were never asked, Do you want to play 3 more
Yeah.
games?
Yeah.
The NFL had a 17th game. Took 2 years to get the players to agree to it, even though they get 50% of all the new money. And so, yeah, it has grown. It has grown because they added more games and they let more teams be in it.
Yeah. And many years ago, we recommended to the CFP that they add athletes on their board.
Yeah.
And that was denied. But again, that's where we get back to who's looking out for the athletes. And so there does have to be. We obviously have common ground on that, maybe a different way of a setup, but there has to be more athlete voice and power in voting on policy. We also have another policy that we think it could have been adopted by the power conferences, but we have next week 3 Division I conferences will receive what we call our CARE model conference grants. And CARE stands for Connecting Athletic Revenues with the Educational Model of College Sports. And 3 Division I conferences have adopted this model and are able to show transparency, number one, with the demographics of their athletes and their staff. They're able to show and meet expectations of their financial distributions, and their financial distributions value education, gender equity, and opportunity. And then they have to meet a certain metric as it relates to financial responsibility. And so this is it's kind of hard for you to grasp the big deal this is that they've signed on to this, but these conferences know it's a new day in college sports, and they've got to show that they're doing things differently. And just to give you a real tangible example, one of the policies that a couple of the conferences had to change. When you look at conference incentives, and again, we're talking about some of the athletes in NIL, but at the big picture, the NCAA gives out financial incentives to institutions, and one of the incentives they reward is for performance in the men's basketball tournament. So Division I schools receive $170 million a year. It's divided up based on how the men's teams do in the tournament. And it was our position from, a principle standpoint, that college sports, one of its core principles is gender equity. And we feel that gender equity needs to apply across the board. So that also means national incentives. So we said to the NCAA, if you're going to reward men's basketball success, you should also reward success in women's teams in the tournament. And so they are moving forward with that plan in another year. They recently adopted that. But for these conferences who will be CARE champions, they are equitably incentivizing success for their men's teams, their women's teams at an equal amount of their men's teams. And for many of those, that required a policy change that, when you've been doing something a certain way for 20 years, it's hard to change. But they've stepped forward and they're doing that. And so we're really proud of this initiative, and we think it can only grow from here.
Even though this is called uncommon ground, you guys having some common ground on this subject in terms of, what the structure needs to look like. I think that's really important. But I'll go back and not want to put words in your mouth, nor do I want you to say something you're uncomfortable with. As I see this from 20,000 feet, because I'm not in the chair anymore, but I read and try to pay attention, and it seems like the leadership in college athletics, it's kind of whack-a-mole right now. Lawsuits, settle this, fix this, we'll do that. And no one's moving toward, that's kind of why I get concerned, nobody's moving towards to keep this enterprise that we all enjoy, the model you said we need to figure out a way to keep our model by doing things differently. It does not appear that that's a focus for anybody. Maybe you. I'm talking about people who can affect that change. You deal with these people, you talk to these people. Are those conversations happening anywhere? Or are we just trying to settle lawsuits and go on to the next season and the next television contract?
I just think for those who are out in front, the bigger schools, bigger conferences, the current system, while it's chaotic, is working. Collectives are funded at those schools, and they're spending the money to get athletes and win, and they're hitting their budgets. And if they got to do the house settlement and start sharing $22 million a year next year with their athletes, they're going to do that too. They can add more scholarships now with scholarship limits coming off, and baseball and softball have unlimited scholarships. So that the haves, if you will, are not feeling as much pain, even though it is whack-a-mole, because the current system is working and they're allowed to stay ahead of the have-nots. And when I say haves and have-nots, I'm not talking about, a Big Ten school and, Murray State, like talking about, a Big Ten school and an ACC school. ACC and Big 12 make tens of millions of dollars less per year on their media deal per school than the Big Ten and the SEC. And so I think that aspect is one reason that's paralyzing change. I think another thing is, a lot of leaders are just trying to get through this and just figure out what they can do to just get to their next contract, hoping that by then this thing will have changed. But once again, it's going to be reliant more on the judiciary branch, and they're asking for help from the legislative branch, Congress, but really they are the ones that have to figure it out and make tough decisions and be leaders. And I'll tell you this, I talked to a lot of my former colleagues who I used to serve with my software company, Influencer and Teamworks. I still talk to a lot of those ADs around the country because what we're doing at athletes.org plays into what they need to do to figure out how they're going to approach all this. And a lot of them are trying to think forward, but to their defense, they have a board of trustees, they have a president that they need to get up to speed on all this change, and that's why it takes so long. You talked about 2008 is when all that started to get change to happen, because there's a lot of channels to work through and steps to get by to make it happen.
Is anybody saying to you on a position of authority, ADs, commissioners, NCAA office that, hey, Amy, your idea of having a separate football league is probably where we need to go? Is anybody having those conversations at all?
Well, we heard great support from it. Actually, football coaches, if you polled football coaches, they're in support of that because they think it would help bring a unifying message to get things done that they need to help their sport. Right now, if you say, who do I call, who's in charge of college football, you have to call, 4 different commissioners, a couple of TV executives. I mean, that's who's in charge of college football. So, coaches want it. Some ADs, yes, want it. Some were hopeful that might come out of the House settlement. Maybe that's, if the House settlement totally goes off the rails, maybe it's an opportunity to try to design, a different structural change moving forward. But, yes, people have said that, but not the ones who can get it done because, again, a lot of the changes as it relates to football has to be agreed upon by the commissioners. And the commissioners are doing a great job with what their job is, which is to create more revenue. Yeah. That's their job. And so, again, it's a function of, not looking out for the collective good of the whole because their job at the SEC is to bring in more money than the Big Ten, and the Big Ten to compete in a way, so it's a very competitive, obviously, environment with no one centrally trying to coordinate for the good of the whole. And obviously Charlie Baker at the NCAA, he's trying to do that, but again, the NCAA has limited authority over football. And so I think that's why there's been a vacuum of leadership to really plot out what's in the best interest of the sport of football and how it impacts the whole. So, we're hopeful that we can still move forward with that really bold change for all of college sports. But in the meantime, we have had leaders come to us and leaders who are actually stepping out there, and they're ones outside the power conferences, but Division I ADs who know there's a different future for college sports. We are in a different moment, and so they are looking at different ways to construct a model where these opportunities for young women and young men to really develop their human potential through sports, where those opportunities can continue in a really positive way, but in a different model. And there's a couple of keys to that. They still want to compete for Division I championships, but they understand they'll have to change some of the ways in which it operates, giving athletes more of a policy involvement and a very meaningful policy involvement on campus at conferences, and also as it relates to control, to educating coaches that there are limits to what you can control in an athlete's life. And we've you know, Division III, I think, is a much healthier environment in that respect, because you still have, you know, a lot of off-season. You don't have the summer expectations of a Division I program, but, you know, there's so much control now that coaches put on athletes that, frankly, is potentially a trigger for employment. And so that's what this group is working on, a model that addresses some of those triggers of employment, and how can we change this and make sure that athletes see the academic outcomes, the experience outcomes, the development outcomes that come from participation, so that athletics participation is not seen as having a negative impact on your academic experience, but is part of that academic and educational experience, because that's what it was always set up to be.
And can I just, on the back of that, she's right. Like, if you go to the first 2 pages of the NCAA's rule book, you read about all these principles that have to do with academics, and all those things are great. But you talk about calling a duck, right? Mm-hmm. The Pac-12 was destroyed so that several schools could make more money per year in media revenue in the Big Ten, right? And it's all about academics, yet Oregon is going to be playing Rutgers on a Wednesday night in women's volleyball, and I could name 10 other examples just like that. And it's going to be really hard for those athletes to be able to compete and be up to par athletically, but also academically manage their schoolwork. And Cal is in the Atlantic Coast Conference. They're going to play a 24,000-mile travel schedule this year. I mean, just think about that. That's a prestigious academic institution. So you talk about calling a duck. I mean, that's the reality here, is we're saying one thing, and there's a lot of those examples in college sports. NIL being used as pay-for-play is another example we haven't gotten too much into, but it's not congruent. It's not congruent with the mission, with the principles of what this is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be a stage-setting experience for the rest of your life.
But
Yeah.
to that point, that realignment happened, and the demise of the Pac-12 happened because of the football footprint.
Right, and they got dragged along.
So that, to our
Exactly.
point, if you had a different structure for football, you could have
Absolutely.
more alignments that make sense in the other sports, that's better for the athlete experience in the long run.
And the longer you wait, the more debris there's going to be. Because with this settlement coming next summer, half the power conference schools will have no problem affording $22 million a year. Internally it'll be hard, but they'll make it happen, right? But then the next half of the power conference schools might even borrow money to be able to afford paying players. And you know what else they're going to do? They're going to cut some costs. And that's where you're going to see a school cut some sports. And that's where you're going to see another school cut some scholarships. And so the beginnings of more debris, where you drag along other sports and other athletes that have nothing to do with football to be able to keep competing in football, will happen. And that's why football separating is the end of this. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of when.
And first of all, we're going to talk about one more thing, and then we're going to get into question and answer. If you have a question, you need mics in front here, all right? But Jim, he and I we may have common ground on this. I don't think it's just totally easy for some schools to take $22 million and make it work, right? Maybe on the front end, maybe the universities chip in. You know, that is going to be a whack-a-mole also. And who's going to pay a price there? Football and basketball is not. And that's why we are here discussing about the future of college athletics, because it could trickle all the way down. It could, you know, not to be Chicken Little, it could trickle down to you folks if the NCAA decides not to put money in the Division III championships, which would be the biggest travesty. So that's why I'm harping on. Somebody needs to start paying attention to what Jim and Amy are saying. We can't wait 10 years to figure this out. 2030, that's 6 years. That would probably be as quick as it could happen, right? But something has to change, or the enterprise, as I like to call it, is going to pay the price, and not football and basketball players. And I'm not saying they should. Jim's right. They shouldn't bear the burden of paying for everybody else. But universities need to figure that out. There's nothing more special than, as you all know, because you all represent a broad-based program, than college athletics. And if we continue to play whack-a-mole and we continue just to get to our next contract, to get to our next TV contract, you know, some student athletes in this country are going to pay a big price, in my opinion. And I think gender equity could be part of that as well. Do you not, Amy?
Well, Title IX is a federal law, and so that's a big question with the proposed House settlement. If you know, if they start sharing revenue with the athletes, you know, I've heard some ADs say, well, most of that's going to go to football and men's basketball. Well, wait a second, how does Title IX apply here? And so that's a major policy question that is yet to be answered. And we think Title IX applies in a lot of ways that it's currently not being addressed, even if with NIL, when institutions are involved with NIL. And so Title IX is one of the best, you know, laws that ever came to be. It's the reason I'm sitting here and I'm looking out and I see, you know, a lot of female athletes, I think, in this audience and the opportunities that have been created. And so again, there's a lot of revenue being generated, but this is also revenue at universities, tax-exempt organizations that by law need to comply with Title IX.
I mean, I think that's absolutely right, and I think it's going to be interesting with Title IX, not just on revenue sharing, but on scholarships, with the limits being, you know, broken down, and now you can really add scholarships in sports as you wish. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the schools approach it all. But I think it's interesting how they're doing the back pay for the settlement. And, you know, more and more of this data is going to be released, I think, once the class notices get sent to athletes going back to 2016, which will allow them to find out what they're going to make from the settlement. Supposedly the biggest check is going to be $1.8 million, so some athlete's going to get that. It's probably like Saquon Barkley, who doesn't need it. But athletes from 2016 to the present will be getting paid in all different sports in Division I, but 90% of that money is going to go to football and men's basketball athletes, because commercially, that's what their share is of the $2.8 billion. So, like, understanding that formula for the schools, and then for the schools, if they want to go with the same formula, what's interesting is, you know, we're not calling these payments pay for play. These are NIL deals between the school and the athlete on paper. That's because the schools don't want the athletes to be employees, and they don't want to pay them salaries, and that's a whole other common ground
next time
conversation. But the point is, and that's another duck, call a duck thing, because it's clearly, you know, this is pay for play. I mean, the judge in the House settlement hearing last week, that was the biggest thing she challenged them on. And so where I'm going with this is, there's a lot of things that this football separation would help, and that would just be another one, the Title IX issue. Because if you're going to compensate football players more because they produce more revenue, doing it inside of the school is going to be a lot harder and still be able to comply with Title IX than it would be if they were part of a separate league.
We're supposed to start asking questions at the 45-minute mark. We're there. Questions for us? There has to be
Who's
a
going to
plan.
break the ice? It's always once the first one goes, there's a line.
Yeah. You got microphones up front.
Oh, sorry. Where are you going to go? So I guess it's pretty understood that the NIL is pay to play. I think that's kind of something that a lot of us can agree on. Something that I remember was Leonard Fournette. He was kind of the one that sparked it in my mind, and choosing to withhold from playing in the college football playoff for his future in the NFL.
Bowl game.
Yeah, the bowl game, yeah. So how does the NCAA, or how do you guys see that playing out with if schools are paying players to play, but they're not fulfilling their expected games in the NCAA? What does that look like going forward with contracts and stuff?
Yeah, so here's the thing. Whether it's bowl opt-outs, which are becoming an issue. We saw it Florida State and Georgia this past year, right? Whether it's transferring every year and, you know, basically athletes leaving each year for a new school, whether it's coaches tampering and stealing players. We've seen squirrel cam videos of opposing coaches going up to players after the game when they're shaking hands, you know, talking to them, and then you see that player transfer 4 months later to that school. all those things can be regulated through a collective agreement between the athletes in the school on, okay, we'll sign contracts to make X amount of money, and we'll do a 2-year deal. And so now I can't transfer until after 2 years, but in exchange, that deal needs to be something the athlete feels is fair, not just an amount, but maybe how much of it's guaranteed. Okay, we won't opt out of bowl games, or if we do, we won't get a game check for that game, right? So there's ways to solve a lot of the things that older school folks complain about with college sports and how it is today, but it comes from having that collective agreement.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks.
He broke the ice.
Hi, guys. I'm here in a room full of successful students, and I can't help and put myself in the shoes of those D1 athletes. I know I'm just a D3 athlete, but if you gave me 7 figures a year, you know, that Friday class at 9 a.m., I might be willing to not go to it. And so, because, you know, I wouldn't be as concerned for my future, perhaps, in terms of like financially supporting myself with a good job post-grad. Do you think, you know, giving that fair share to the athletes could have perhaps some bad consequences in that sense? Do you get what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that if any of us, when we're 18 to 22, have that type of money come our way, we're going to need help, right? And the good news is, when you make that kind of money, there's a lot of people that can help you. You're going to have a team of people that can help you. And we've seen athletes make 7 figures and give deals back to their teammates for them to make money too. We've seen Blake Corum give away turkeys with his own money every Thanksgiving for the last 3 years. We've seen a lot of athletes do a lot of great things. Have we seen athletes make mistakes? Yeah. We've seen young tennis athletes who are pros at young ages make mistakes too. But the reality is, it's free labor in America, and the amount of money they produce is what they deserve to be compensated. So then it comes down to, how can they be given the tools they need to manage it properly and to set themselves up right. As far as the academic example of the class on Friday at 9 a.m., that's why inside of the deal between the athletes and the schools, you have academic requirements, or else you can't get paid. It's part of your whole situation. So academics should still be a big part of it. And for an NFL prospect who's just waiting 3 years to make that big check, it already is kind of that way, you know? So I think that all those things are great points, and it's the human nature of somebody who's young having that kind of money.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would just say that the eligibility rules still apply.
Yeah.
But that is a big question moving forward. I mean, in part because of academic eligibility rules that were put in place as a result of the original Knight Commission work that Kit worked on. Athletes have to show that they're making progress toward a degree. And so there's certain benchmarks you have to meet. So those are not being challenged because that is being a student is part of college sports. And so again, and Jeff Kessler, who's the one who brought all these different lawsuits, he has said, we're not going to challenge the academic eligibility requirements because that's not an antitrust violation. That's legal because that's part of being a college sport. That's part of being a student. And that's what, again, our work is to really, college sports should be more than just the name of the college on the jersey, right? It should be what that experience is for the students participating in the sport.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys want athletes to be involved in the decision making, but there's little to no continuity in the player bases as opposed to the NBA, where the heads of the players associations have been there for 10 to 15 years and they know the deal. So how would you manage their inability to see a long-term full picture and have the best interests for athletes for years to come?
Well, the NFL, the average lifespan of a player is 2.7 years, which is less than the 4 years of eligibility that college athletes have. So it's proven that it can work. You have to have a good system for incoming athletes to be able to know that this is part of their college experience, being a part of this association, learning the business that they're now entering. And every team will have a rep. And that one player on the team, their job is to understand this really well so that they can involve their teammates, who some may be very interested and some may not. My business partner on this, Brandon Copeland, just retired from a 10-year NFL career. And last summer when he retired, he was a player rep. There's 32 player reps in the NFL, one for each of the 32 teams. He was a player rep his last few seasons. And he said, really us 32 players, one from each team, really represent what all 1,800 are going to end up having happen. And a lot of those other 1,800 don't really participate much in it. So the voice happens through the player reps in the NFL, in the NBA, in most pro leagues. That's how it's set up. But giving each team a leader that can vote on these key issues with their school is something that can definitely be done. Even with a 4-year average term, it's done in the NFL, and it's 2.7 years average term.
That's, of course, Jim's model for athletes.org. The Knight Commission, we recommended years ago now that the NCAA change its governance policy at the national level, and we drew it from actually the USOC, the National Governing Board for our Olympic and Paralympic. They require a third of their board has to be Olympians that have competed within the past 10 years. So it doesn't have to be a current athlete, but someone who's very fresh and coming out of that experience. And so we replicated that and what we had recommended to the NCAA to change its governance to have, more athletes within that 10-year experience, to have, seats and votes at the table. Again, unfortunately, they've gotten more votes, but not enough in our view. But that's my answer to your question, to have, more representatives for athletes. And again, the seats at the table, there's just been too much self-interest the way the NCAA is governed. And so if it would open it up, have more athletes, current, former athletes, and also there should be a mandatory seat voting at the table, divisions 1, 2, and 3, for someone who is designated and an expert on health and safety issues. And that's another recommendation, again, past time for that to happen. But, that sounds very simple, and so it's really, disappointing that it hasn't happened in the face of, all the litigation that's coming about. And those are easy changes that presidents could do tomorrow.
Thank you both.
Mm-hmm.
Good evening.
Evening.
First and foremost, I'd like to say that I am a swimmer here at Hamilton, and recent events, specifically the House lawsuit, has led to the NCAA proposing roster decreases across D1 NCAA swimming, both for the men's and women's team. And as of right now, athletes are getting cut, recruits aren't getting recruited, and mega conferences are causing conference meets to become almost as competitive as the Olympic trials. Going the extra mile to maximize profits in this business model that mainly fits basketball or football schedule where, every game, every week counts, doesn't really fit with a lot of sports, specifically in swimming. Like, dual meets are basically just training blocks, and now we have to go the extra mile and make them more profitable, have higher performance, which gets in the way of optimal training. And so I just don't know how it's really helping all sports when I feel like it is actively hurting our sport. Why do we have to go the extra mile to go out of our way to not do optimal training to fit this business model that does not fit our sport?
Well said.
True.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you said, and the roster limits, that's a whole nother, complicated detail of the House settlement, but the young man made the point that, again, our broader point is there will be lost opportunities because of the solution that is being formulated because of commercial, the commercial business of big-time football. And so, we just think let's do something for the collective good. This is about opportunities in all sports, and it would be much cleaner to separate that sport and protect the opportunities with all the sports that mean so much to you and young women and men just, that compete in that sport, and others that are having, roster changes at Division I just to make the numbers work for what they're doing with football.
Yeah, I would just add that it's a reality that I mentioned earlier, that a lot of things are being unraveled while we wait to fix the problem we all know we need to fix. And if football was separate, not only would there be a bigger pie of money because it would make more money on its own, but a lot of these other things could be rethought and done in a way where schedules are more regional. Rhythms of play make more sense for each of those sports. I could keep going, but ultimately, so all these sports aren't being dragged along with football. And that's where it will end up, but the question is, how long will that take and how much will be unraveled once we get there?
And like Jim and Amy said earlier, the basic issue there is that the courts are telling us how to run our business. That's a part of a settlement, is roster limits, scholarship, expansion. It's the professionals aren't running our profession. Courts are running our profession right now.
And the courts are being, pushed to do that by former athletes who, if they were just given a voice while they were there and included, might not have gone to those lengths, and that's kind of the full circle aspect of this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to start off, thank you so much for a great discussion so far. So my question doesn't relate as much to NIL money. I think a lot of us D3 athletes can agree that we don't really get much access to that. So I was kind of more focused on the transfer portal. So with the transfer portal rules now changing, you have a lot of athletes changing schools or given incentive to change schools, like the Colorado State quarterback offered, I think it was $300,000 or $600,000, something like that, to transfer schools. And then you also have Dabo Sweeney, who's not taking transfers. But on the D3 level, you have athletes who, maybe their dream school is to play soccer, at a school like Hamilton, and they play goalie, but sadly, a senior or a junior at another school is now transferring and plays goalie, and now their dreams are kind of crushed. So I was wondering, what are your takes on the transfer portal, and are there any policies that might be in the works to change, those kind of rules regarding to that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll jump in first, if that's okay. Your first example was, I think, one in which you used the example of a quarterback being offered over $300,000 to transfer, and we all know that is going on. That activity is actually a violation of the NCAA rule, which prohibits NIL from being used as recruiting inducements. But those rules were suspended because the NCAA, again, is being sued in terms of trying to enforce its NIL rules. So that particular example, I wanted to highlight that because it's a great example, because where we are today, college sports has less regulation than pro sports around endorsement and NIL. Pro sports teams have salary caps, and teams, owners cannot be involved in endorsement deals for the pro players. So we're in this crazy moment in time when college sports was always over-regulated, and now at the highest levels it has less regulation than pro sports. The transfer portal, though, I think, in a big picture, the changing the transfer rules was the right thing to do, because you want to, from a principle standpoint, again, with our work, we always look at what's the principle in play here. You want to be fair to athletes across the board and treat athletes like every other student, and not penalize an athlete in football who wants to transfer. allow that immediate eligibility, since there were 3 sports that when you transferred, you had to sit out a year. And so it was to treat athletes fairly across the board and treat them like other students. So, where it has gotten chaotic is because that transfer rule changed at the same time NIL started, and there's been no ability to enforce the recruiting inducements part of it. So I think, if the NCAA can find a way to not allow the recruiting inducements for transfers, that so that schools actually are abiding by the rules in play, I think that will help. I think there are some changes with regard to windows of time in terms of the transfer portal, shortening those windows when that can be open. But again, the academic rules are still in play. If a student transfers, you still have to meet those progress toward degree requirements. And so those haven't gone away, and there have been cases where athletes have not transferred to a certain school because they weren't going to meet those progress toward degree requirements.
Yeah, I mean, the transfer portal happened at a time where NIL happened, and it was like the perfect storm where you already knew that when Pandora's box was opened with NIL, boosters were going to get involved somehow. Nobody could foresee the word collective, meaning a shell company that donors use to clean money so they can pay players to go there. Like, nobody saw that, but you kind of knew something along those lines was going to happen, and then you couple it with the DOJ saying you can't treat non-employees with non-competes, no transfer rules, at the same time. It just created this explosion. And there's a lot of good examples of the transfer portal, like I used earlier today, Dalton Connect, lottery pick with the Lakers, like starts off playing basketball, I believe JUCO, and then small D1, and then ends up at Tennessee, and here he is. And there's other stories like that. And Jay Billis said to me on my podcast, he said, why should Connect be, if he was a 1-star or a 2-star out of high school, well, maybe he gets better. Why does he always have to be at the same school the whole time? He should be able to transfer up. And he did. And there's other examples like that. But on the other side, transfer portal is eliminating a story that we've seen, or some of you may have lived out, where a good player goes to a school and it doesn't work out the first year, but they stay and they work it out and they persevere and they go through a system with their coach where they earn some playing time in year 2, and then year 3 they start, and then year 4 they're a captain, and then they're at the team banquet at the end of the year and they're crying, telling this story about how their mom and their coach told them to stay, and they worked it out, and that story's gone. But once again, the commitment to the team, the commitment to that kind of story can be put back together with a structured deal that the athletes agree to, with multi-year terms, with regulation around how recruiting inducements are used to tamper and steal players. But you can't regulate any of that without that kind of partnership between the athletes and the schools, which you should look at it like as free agency in pro sports. If there's no rules, just imagine what would happen.
But in free agency, the team can't use recruiting inducement to the free agent.
Because there's a collective bargaining agreement. In the WNBA, they have a collective bargaining agreement, and they shut down a deal between the city of Las Vegas and each of the players on the Las Vegas Aces, $100,000 each, which is more than their average salary per player to play in the WNBA, and they shut it down because that would give the Las Vegas Aces an unfair advantage, right? That's the only way you stop collectives in college sports. Yeah. But you'd have to have that kind of agreement. And I think, last week when the hearing took place for the House settlement, the reason that it did not get preliminarily approved like most thought it would is she wanted the NCAA lawyers and the lawyers for the athletes to take a few weeks and come back with better language around NIL limitations for athletes on top of revenue sharing, which basically means that collectives are going to stay around even when schools are able to share revenue with the athletes. And so it's pretty tough to regulate without a collective agreement between the athletes and the schools.
We got time for one more question.
Good evening. I just wanted to quickly ask what your thoughts are on players receiving official prize pool earnings under non-NCAA competitions, such as recently a friend of mine went to the U.S. Open and was paid 6 figures in official earnings, and he was not able to receive that due to him going to a college. I was wondering if you believe he should or should not be paid those earnings, and why.
You know, that's a new court case, so that's another one that just got started, and I would predict that they'll win, as most have against the NCAA this century. And it's because it's not just that they would not be able to receive that prize while also playing college sports, especially when we just talked about what's happening with other athletes playing sports and being able to be paid by collectives and other NIL brand deals. So I would say I agree with them being able to keep the money.
Yeah, I think this goes back to the amateurism word is really no longer, but amateurism is whatever the organization defines it to be, and for many years, and that's why this court case is, an athlete cannot accept prize money and retain their eligibility unless it's prize money under the Olympic Gold Plan. There's a couple of exceptions, and so I think as this system has evolved, and that you can win prize money at an Olympic, but not at the U.S. Open, it's really kind of inconsistent. So I think I agree that there will probably see some type of change in that rule as it pertains to prize money. And again, we're in a new era of just really re-examining what's fair and what's really necessary for college sports to be college sports and played by students. So, yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you.
I'm a moderator. I have a little flexibility here. Do we have one more? Somebody's been waiting?
We have more.
So there's been a lot of talk of like separation of college football from the other sports, but obviously college football is the revenue stream for all of these other Division I sports, especially, women's sports. So without college football, who should be funding these sports? Do you think that it'll end up turning into like these big Division I schools without football, they turn more into like Division III programs, or do you think that they should pull funding from other places in order to fund these sports?
Well, I'd say that in terms of, the funding right now, there are over 200 universities in Division I that don't compete in big revenue football. And the majority, more than 60% of their funding comes from institutional funding and student fees to provide the opportunities. 100% of the funding, in Division III and Division II are like that in terms of the institution providing the funding for these opportunities. So, I think what we're saying with the big revenue football, those 60 to 70 programs, again, they're still going to be playing big revenue football under the university's name. So it's not going to be, they're not going to lose total funding, for their other sports programs from separating football. It'll just be a different structure than it is now.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it from a standpoint of this being similar to the NFL teams are owned by owners, and they do their best to make the team as profitable as possible so them and all their shareholders can make money, right? Well, this would be different in that the school would be trying to run football, make as much money as they can, make as much profits as they can to put back into the athletic program each year for the other sports. But their costs would include compensating athletes in that model. It still would allow them to be profitable enough to give back to these other sports and support athletics. For the licensing of using the stadium, the marks of the school, like all of those things would justify that revenue share between the football program separate from the school with the athletic program.
Thank you. All right, we are...
And I would say this, you were in softball? Yeah. Well, the Division I women's softball championship actually makes revenue. I mean, it's a very popular sport. So there are other sports programs that are generating revenue for the athletics program.
Well, we're coming here. Thank you. We're coming down. This is the home stretch here. And first of all, thank you again for all being here tonight. Thank you for those questions. They were incredible. Thank you, Hamilton College, for having me, Jim, and Aim. Quickly, before we end here, Amy, do you have a final comment?
I think, if it didn't come across, I've been saying we've been experiencing the dog years of college sports. For those of you who don't know, a dog ages 7 years for every human year, and we've experienced about 14 years worth of changes of policy in the past 2 years. But again, the most important thing from our standpoint is for the way forward, for presidents, commissioners, athletic directors, to really put the athlete experience at the forefront of the decisions that are going to be made. And, the young man speaking for swimming, I think, provided a great example. Let's not lose opportunities for some sports because we can't figure out the solution for, the most successful sport.
College athletes that are affected by what we talked about tonight, whether it's the swimming example or the football player or in between, deserve to be informed at a high degree on all that's going on in the business that they play a part in. And as they're informed, they deserve to have a voice and a seat at the table to really be able to help their school create an equitable plan for all the athletes. And so, that's, to me, one of the two inevitable parts of the future of college sports, because having an agreement with your athletes and partnering with them is how you protect yourself in court from more lawsuits, but it's also going to be a recruiting advantage for the schools that choose to do it, and it's going to give their athletes a chance to understand the business they're a part of at an earlier age. So I'm excited about that. I think the House settlement really kicks it off if it gets approved, because revenue sharing starts 10 months from now, and that's a new era for college sports. It's not the last era. There's still more that has to happen, but it will be a big transformational period.
Thank you, Jim and Amy. Before we leave, I just wanted to share, I want to read a quote here that my friend Kip Morris gave to me, and it's written by, it's from a graduation speech at Williams College that was given by A. Bartlett Giamatti, who used to be the commissioner of baseball back in 1997, and his whole speech, I'm not going to read it, but it talks about why do we care? And obviously you folks care, that's why you're here tonight. Obviously Amy and Jim, this is their life. I cared for 40 years about college athletics. That's what I did, and that's what we do. And obviously there's a lot of caring in this room, but his comment was, why do we care? We care because we truly believe athletics plays a valuable role in an individual's education. Athletics can be a liberal pursuit, an activity pursued in and of itself for the sheer joy of stretching the spirit as perhaps nothing else can. There are values, and we hear so much about values in education and how they are missing. The individual learns of cooperation, fairness, dedication, discipline, as well as lessons about limitation and how to live with failure that are valuable and necessary to learn for life. That's the value of college athletics. That is why we care. And with people like this, Amy and Jim and others leading the charge, the future has challenges, but I was around college athletics long enough to know that, and I did it for a long time, whatever the challenge was, somehow, some way, we figured it out. And I'm confident we will here. So thank you so much for being with us tonight. And again, Hamilton, thank you for having us.